Hello everyone. Today I will tell you about the film 12 Years a Slave. Enjoy watching! Before watching, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'm trying to develop this channel, and your support is the only thing I have. The film begins with a group of slaves being instructed in cutting sugar cane. A man sits on a cart with raw cane root, watching the slaves. The next scene. Thought slaves. Solomon Northup notices the dark juice of blackberries and is inspired to create ink and a pen. But the juice turns out to be too liquid for these purposes. Solomon remembers happy times with his family. He is a free man, plays the violin superbly, and is a famous performer at his home in Saratoga. Later, he talks to his cook wife, and is angry that her members have the opportunity to cook. The next morning, he sees them off to their carriage. That same day, he meets two escorts, Brown and Helmington, who claim to be working in a circus show. They provide a large sum for him to accompany them to Washington. He agrees. Arriving in Washington, they decide to have dinner at a restaurant. Solomon is poisoned in the wine and chained in a damp cell. He is beaten mercilessly and sent to a slave pen with the others. He discusses his situation with Clemens, an apparently educated slave, who tells him of the dire nature of their situation. Soon the mother, Eliza, and the daughter are brought to the pen as well. Under cover of darkness, they are dragged from their cell, chained, and carried onto a riverboat. They are led into the hold, which is crammed with other human cargo. Clemens repeats his advice to Solomon to keep a low profile, denying his ability to read and write. They meet a slave named Robert, who wants to rebel and take over the ship. Later that night, a slaver rapes Eliza. Robert tries to stop the rape, but is stabbed and killed. Clemens and Solomon are accused of dumping a body in the river. When they arrive, Clemens's master is waiting for them and immediately demands the return of his stolen property. Clemens throws himself gratefully into his master's arms. Solomon has lost his only friend. Upon landing, a slave trader, Freeman, rouses his new property by announcing their names. He names Solomon Platt. The noble plantation owner, Ford, takes an interest in Solomon and Eliza. She begs him to take her and her children, but Freeman refuses, quickly selling her son to another buyer. Ford tries to buy her daughter, but Freeman refuses again. Ford can only afford to pay for the two of them. Eliza is distraught and screams wildly in grief, disrupting the sale. Solomon is ordered to play the violin to cheer up. Ford transports his purchases back to his plantation. Eliza sobs the entire way. Ford's wife mentions that food and a night's rest will help her forget them. The next morning, the slaves are introduced to Tibbs, the slave handler, and Ford's overseer, Chapin. Tibbs sings a mocking song to keep the slaves from escaping as they do their work. They continue to chop wood and eventually meet a small group of natives with whom they rest. Solomon notices a stringed instrument and remembers his fiddle. The next day, Solomon, against Clemens's advice, approaches Ford with a new idea to transport lumber across the river. Ford is impressed by Solomon's opinion. Ford offers Solomon to play the fiddle as a reward. He sells Eliza, as Ford's wife cannot stand the noise of her crying. Over the next few days, Tibbs tries to get revenge on Solomon. He tries to beat Solomon, who resists and defeats him. At that moment, Chapin appears and forces Tibbs to run away. He warns him that he cannot protect him if he runs away. We later learn that Tibbs has gathered some thugs to hang Solomon for daring to fight him. They put a noose around his neck and prepare to hang him, but Chapin shows up with a gun in time and drives them off, but leaves Solomon hanging there, barely supporting his weight on his tiptoes. Punishment for hitting a white man. Later in the evening, Ford finally returns and cuts the rope, saving Solomon. He drags him into the house for protection, but decides that he must be sold. It is here that we learn that Ford has sold Solomon to a notorious plantation owner named Epps, who is known for his merciless beatings. Epps recites a passage from the Bible to strengthen his hold on slaves. The next day is cotton harvest day. Solomon's crop is below average. Slaves who pick less than the previous day are given lashes. Meanwhile, Patsy is almost twice as productive as any worker. It is clear that he is enchanted by her, and his wife is not pleased. Epps enters the slave quarters and wakes them up, creating an impromptu dance with Patsy the center of attention. Epps's wife throws a heavy crystal decanter into Patsy's face, brutally cutting her. She demands that Epps sell Patsy, but he claims that he would send his wife away before losing Patsy. Mistress Epps sends Solomon on an errand to the store. She hands him a list and notices that he is reading it. She makes it clear that he is not to do so. On the way to the store, Solomon is inspired to attempt an escape, but is lynched. Seeing the fate of the two men, he continues on to the store. Seeing the paper, he comes up with the idea of taking a spare sheet of paper every time he writes a letter. Sometime later, Epps sends Solomon to a nearby plantation owned by Shaw. Shaw has married one of his slaves and elevated her status, at least on his plantation. Patsy has come to visit, enjoying the luxury. But apparently Epps is jealous that Shaw might try to get her into bed. A drunk Epps rapes Patsy during the night. Mistress Epps is fed up with her husband's affair and scolds Patsy before brutally slashing her face. Later that night, Patsy begs Solomon to strangle her and dispose of her body. She can no longer bear the burden of Epps's rape and the torment of his wife. Solomon refuses despite her pleas. Sometime later, we see that Epps's cotton liabilities have been destroyed by insects. 2 crops have been lost, and so he decides to lend his slaves to a judge who can make some use of them and pay off the debt for their purchases. This brings us back to the first scene where Solomon is cutting sugarcane. The judge notices Solomon's skill and recommends him to a neighbor who is looking for music for the evening. As a bonus, the judge says that Solomon can keep any wages he earns. As the evening progresses, Solomon clearly sees the parallels between his former life as a free man and his forced servitude. The evening comes to an end, and it is time to return to Epps's farm. As Solomon approaches the house, Patsy's bloody eye indicates that her torment continues. The cotton crop has been harvested, which means it is time to return to the fields. This time, they are joined by a white laborer, Ormsby, who is trying to earn money to get back on his feet. Despite his productivity being significantly lower than any of the other workers, he is spared the whippings that all the other slaves receive. In the barracks, he tends to Solomon's wounds and tells his story. He comes across as a decent man and a good listener. Solomon decides to take a chance on him, trusting him to send a letter north in the hopes of securing his freedom. He gives Ormsby all his proceeds from the party and swears him to secrecy. He will deliver the letter to him in 2 days. Solomon sets about making ink and sketching out a draft of the letter. Just that night, Epps enters the cabin and leads Solomon outside. Ormsby has broken his word and told Epps everything. Fortunately, he tells his story before Solomon gives him the letter. Thinking quickly and playing on Epps's low opinion of slaves, he turns the story around from Ormsby, calling him a liar who is trying to curry favor in order to get a job. This story convinces Epps. Solomon later burns the letter and watches his hopes for freedom turn to ashes. Sometime later, we find a team of workmen building structures with the help of hired hand Bass. Bass is from the north and holds strong views that conflict with Epps's pro-slavery beliefs. Epps thinks Patsy has run away and threatens all women with violence over her loss. However, she has simply returned to Shaw's plantation to visit her friend. She tries to convince Epps that she is faithful to him and has gone there to get soap, a luxury denied to her by Epps's wife. She loudly proclaims her worth and insists that she deserves to be clean. Epps's bickering drives him to extremes, and he demands that Patsy be tied to the whipping post. As he prepares to strike, he finds himself unable to strike her. He insists that Solomon do it. At first, Solomon tries to be gentle, but Mrs. Epps sees through the deception and pushes her husband to increase his severity. Epps points a pistol at Solomon's head and declares that he will kill every slave unless he beats Patsy harder. Faced with a choice, he beats her harder. After he pauses, Epps rushes forward, seething with rage, and finally lashes out at Patsy himself. The brutal punishment tears her flesh to shreds, and she faints. Solomon finds himself alone with Bass, the hired hand. He asks where he is from, and when Bass replies that he is from Canada, Solomon explains the country, explaining his plight. Bass begins to believe Solomon's story and understands the terrible injustice of it. As they continue to work, Solomon takes a risk and asks Bass to write letters to his friends in Saratoga. Bass agrees. Then the work is finished and he leaves. A long shot lingers on Solomon. He has no idea if Bass will keep his word. Sometime later, the slaves are cultivating and planting the seeds. The carriage pulls up to Epps's plantation, and an official-looking man calls out to Solomon's chambers. When he approaches, it turns out to be the sheriff. The man asks him a few questions and points to another man in the carriage. It is Mr. Parker, a storekeeper from Saratoga and a friend of Solomon's. Without further prompting, the sheriff is convinced, and Solomon rushes to embrace his friend. Epps is furious and shouts empty threats. The sheriff refutes the arguments, and Parker helps Solomon into the carriage that will take him to safety. Solomon jumps out of the carriage to embrace Patsy one last time before leaving. As he leaves, Patsy collapses with grief. Solomon has now been taken home. He is shocked to be freed from his nightmare. As he enters, he sees his family. They are 12 years older, but are stunned to see him. His daughter is married and named their son Solomon Northup. Tears flow as they gather around him and welcome him home. In the end credits, we are told that he tried to sue his captors, but failed. Northup became an ambulance worker and helped many fugitives gain their freedom.